Arctic is warming at more than twice the average rate of the rest of the world. It's also clear that the loss of ice in the Arctic is transforming both the geography and the geopolitics of the region. And it's in this context that we've seen growing strategic interest in the region from the US, from Russia, from China, from the European Union, from the UK, and many other actors. And I think although we regularly hear the refrain that what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic, this tends to be about making a leap from talking about the Arctic in circumpolar terms as a region governed by the regional politics of the 8 Arctic states, and leaping to a kind of a more global idea of the Arctic, that the Arctic is an object of global politics. And with a few exceptions, and here I can see certain people in the room who I know share this view, there's been far less debate about the role that the changing Arctic is playing and will continue to play in the security and geopolitics of the adjoining regions, namely the North Atlantic and the Baltic, or what I and others have termed the wider North. For us, a clearer connection still needs to be made between what is happening across these different regions to convey the sense in which they're very much inseparable in strategic terms. And to help us take a significant step in that direction, we're delighted to welcome a fantastic panel of speakers who will all offer their views on recent developments in US, in Russia, in China, and EU Arctic strategy, and think about what these developments mean for security in the wider North, both now and in the future. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn to our first speaker, who is Dr. Rebecca Pincus, Assistant Professor in the Strategic and Operational Research Department in the Center for Naval Warfare Studies at the US Naval War College in the US. Dr. Pincus, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that welcome, Duncan and Elizabeth. Thank you for inviting me to speak here. First, I'm going to lead off by noting that while I am an employee of the US government, I am speaking today and offering you my own personal opinions as an academic. So please understand that I am not speaking as a representative of the United States Navy or the Department of Defense in any way. It's important that I emphasize that disclaimer because I am going to offer some thoughts about, obviously, the recent major change in US strategy, which is the change in our administration. And while it is still quite early, the Biden-Harris administration is still filling out its ranks and establishing its policy priorities. And so to a certain extent, I'm reading tea leaves here. And there's also an overwhelming focus, obviously, on the ongoing COVID pandemic. But I think it is possible at this point to make a few observations and predictions about the direction of US Arctic strategy and policy under President Biden. So I'm going to offer 4 points briefly. I know I'm going to keep it within 10 minutes, and then I'm looking forward to the discussion. So the first point is that we already see a return to conventional ways. This administration is full of experienced policymakers. There are many veterans returning from the Obama administration who have a great deal of experience. We see a return to conventional behaviors like daily press briefings, not only at the White House, but also at the State Department and at the Department of Defense. So we see a combination of experience and also a pretty clearly signaled desire to draw a contrast from the past administration. So I would say it's pretty clear that we'll see a return to what used to be a prevailing norm of cordial diplomatic relations in the Arctic. It's very hard to imagine another Rovaniemi surprise, for example. I think we could have high confidence that the Arctic Council will issue a joint declaration at its next ministerial towards the end of May. So that's one. We're seeing this sort of return to conventional norms. Secondly, it's also very clear that the Biden-Harris administration is strongly signaling its intention to reassure allies and partners. Just last week, speaking to the Munich Security Conference, President Biden said, "America is back." Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin recently published an opinion piece in the Washington Post, pledging to consult together decide together, and act together. So there is a strong focus on working with allies and partners, and NATO is a central focus of that. So that also gives us a signal about the likely course of US strategy towards the Arctic region under this new administration. Third, the Biden-Harris administration is also taking very strong action on climate change, which is a marked shift from the last administration. The United States has rejoined the Paris Accord, and through executive order, President Biden has reestablished the Northern Bering Sea Climate Resilience Area, so a protected area in the Northern Bering Sea that was developed in consultation with Alaska Indigenous communities. And he has also withdrawn areas of offshore Alaska waters from leasing for energy development. So another clear signal about the direction towards environmental protection and a reduction in prioritization of energy development in the United States Arctic. Furthermore, Biden's executive order on climate directs all departments and agencies across the United States government to immediately commence work to confront the climate crisis. So that's probably a pretty clear signal about what the likely priority will be for the administration when it comes to Arctic strategy. Although we don't have an explicit statement yet, it is likely to revolve around climate change. Fourth, and my last key observation is in a little bit different direction. So far we've seen sort of diplomatic norms, reassuring allies and partners, confronting climate change. But interestingly, President Biden is the first American president in recent memory who has not pursued a reset in relations with Russia. Instead, the president has led off with a very forceful message. And this is a real difference because the last several presidents have come into office seeking a reset, seeking to make some sort of marked step forward in relations. And in contrast, President Biden spoke about his first phone call with President Putin and said, and I'm going to quote this, "I made it clear to President Putin in a manner very different from my predecessor that the days of the United States rolling over in the face of Russia's aggressive actions are over." It's a pretty strong statement. And he went on to say, quote, "We will not hesitate to raise the cost on Russia." That's interesting because obviously we're at a point right now where Russia is about to take the chair of the Arctic Council in May of this year. It will also be chairing the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. So for the next 2 years, Russia will be hosting important diplomatic meetings on the Arctic. And we also will see a simultaneous effort on the part of this administration to continue to pressure Russia. It's not yet clear how this sort of forceful approach is going to play out in the Arctic specifically. Obviously, over the last couple of years, we saw a pretty significant increase in the tempo, nature, and scale of US and coordinated military exercises in and around the Arctic region, particularly in the North Atlantic and the Barents. And so one thing I'll be watching for is how those play out this year, particularly this summer, as ice conditions retreat and it's easier for naval ships to operate. The US continues to pursue leasing an icebreaker. And so it will be interesting to see if that moves forward and what types of operations that icebreaker supports. Over the winter, we saw one of the few remaining American icebreakers, the Polar Star, sent north to the Arctic for the first time in many years instead of its regular trip down to Antarctica. So it will be interesting to watch the operational tempo in the Arctic and the adjacent regions. I think that'll be a clear signal. And that's my question mark going forward. How will this desire for cordial diplomatic relations, norms of behavior, working closely with allies on climate change, intersect with the desire to continue to apply coordinated pressure on Russia? I'm going to stop there. Those were the few points I wanted to skim through, and I'm really looking forward to the other speakers. So I'll wrap up, and I hope that's given you something to chew on, and I'll look forward to the discussion. Thanks again.
Thank you, Dr. Pincus. That was a really excellent start there and very clear presentation around those 4 points. We will be coming back to questions and discussions after we've heard from the entire panel. So I'm going to turn now to our second speaker, who is Professor Caroline Kennedy-Pipe, my colleague from Loughborough University, who is Professor of International Security and International Relations and also a great expert on Russia. So Professor Kennedy-Pipe, over to you.
Thank you, Duncan. Excellencies, Elizabeth, friends old and new. I'd like to follow on from what Becca had to say and give some observations about Russia and the state of play under and in its approaches to the new Biden administration. My first point would be that I don't think much is going to change in Russia Arctic policy. The development of the Arctic has long been a national security strategy and security imperative for Russia. And I think what we've seen is, with the discovery of oil and gas reserves, coupled with the post-World War II fear of invasion, a longer term strategy of industrial development in the Arctic. The Soviet strategy for Arctic development is state-centric, with near total reliance on two things. The first is resource extraction, and the second is military modernization. And that strategy has been revived under Vladimir Putin, and I don't expect to see that change. Russia's pursuit of military and industrial progress in the Arctic is part and parcel of national identity. It's an important part and a driver for urban development in places like Siberia. And in particular, under Soviet rule, and I'll come back to why I think we still need to think about some aspects of Soviet rule, populating Arctic settlements was considered a sine qua non of great power status. And under the Kremlin, we know, under Stalin in particular, however, unsavory forced migration of people into parts of the Arctic, as well as voluntary settlements. And the Soviet Union and its successor Russia has always had long-standing concerns about sovereignty issues in the Arctic, and as Duncan said, what we term the wider North. And in particular, we can talk about the battle over sovereignty in both its older form, after America bought Alaska, of course, in 1867, and what I think we see with sovereignty plus militarism is, if you like, the symbolism of militaries as they operate in the Arctic. The large military bases established on all sides during the Cold War, whether at Fairbanks, were symbolic, highly symbolic of strategic reach, of course, during the Cold War, of nuclear superpower status. But I think we should also note, alongside the establishment of military bases, they're never simply military. They're drivers for economic, for infrastructure, and for logistical change. In many ways, these bases help the consumer trajectory of many of the Arctic communities. And in particular, of course, militarization can be, as we've seen in Greenland, an extremely important part and an economic driver. It increases populations, it increases investment. If we think of the airports in Iceland, let's just think about Keflavik, built by the militaries of the US and the UK. In Russia, the military built the first all year round airports in Siberia. My point is here, we need to think about militarism in the Arctic slightly differently, and I've certainly been guilty of not seeing it in the round in the past. The vitality of cities and communities can actually depend on some of these bases and some of the reach of the United States, of course, Russia, and let us see what our experts say about China. The military installations also, much as we're wary of them, do serve crucial, as we all know, important emergency search and rescue functions. The commercial sector cannot develop in a warming Arctic without precisely that uptake in some form of activities from bases. Another aspect I would like us to think about today, and I'd be very grateful for everyone's thought, is of course Russia's status as a great power. Perhaps not as great as the Soviet Union, but still as a great power, is bolstered by its high levels of oil and gas output. Thus, the abundance of hydrocarbons and the steadily rising output of gas and oil from the region has been equated with Russia's return to power. My point is that this empowerment of Russia under Vladimir Putin through hydrocarbons is hugely important to its self-identity as a great power, to its social cohesion and to its cultural politics. And yet here's the rub. We've yet to see in Russian strategy towards the Arctic, it seems to me, any long-term planning for the eventual post-fossil fuel production, which will necessarily affect Russia in the Arctic. So my point is, let's worry about the uptake in military, but let's also have a think about where Russia goes after that dependence on hydrocarbons has run out. So my point is we should look at political economy, and of course political economy in terms of hydrocarbons is firmly entrenched. There's a dependency there. And so a great power dependent really on the oil and gas sector and its relationship with China has a degree of fragility about it, however we think about remilitarization and the so-called guns and ammo dimensions. I think there's something else that's very interesting here that I would say, actually we can look across the Arctic communities. Many cultural identities across the Arctic are propped up by the oil and gas industries for now. Many communities derive well-being and vitality from that. So to understand Russia, I think, is to understand its position as a great Arctic power, but also the deficiencies in the terms of its future and future economic policies, as well as, of course, the well-known dip in demographics in the Russian Arctic, the high suicide rates, and what we see as the absence of women. We always cause trouble, Becca. But basically, the question here, and Becca touched on it, is what will Washington do to shape and deal with Putin's Russia in a Biden administration? And let me say two things without wanting to be offensive to our American guests. There has to be a grave question mark about Washington's ability to shape Russia's future. The great Sovietologist Stephen Cohen coined the phrase in 1992 that the best we could hope for was a cold peace between Russia. Not a cold war, but a cold peace. And he argued that we had to understand post-1991 that Russia had to find its own destiny within the limits of its traditions and cultures, and that we had to understand those limitations before we could deal with Russia. And I think there's also a big question for all of us, which is what exactly collapsed in 1991? If we think about a new Cold War, it seems to me that we misread what actually collapsed in 1991. And provocatively, I would like to say that I think what we lost in 1991 was our responsibility, if you like, to deal with spheres of influence, to balance power, to understand the plurality of sovereignties and not be hidebound as we now are, I would say, with a Western-centric view of sovereignty. And I'd like to say that I think the world now looks more like 1917 than 1945. But here's the thing, the geopolitics of the Arctic are really always seen as hidebound. Geography doesn't change, even if it melts a lot. But the point that we make in our work at Loughborough on the wider north is actually lines are different. If you look at the dissolution of the Soviet Union rather than the collapse, what changed for Russia is everything came closer. And this is particularly an issue, I think, for their interpretation of cultural politics and sovereignty in the Baltics. And those lines are redrawn, bringing with it a really different set of relationships with Finland and Sweden, not in NATO. And here's the other rub, as it were, when we think about whether Russia is a wolf in sheep's clothing or a sheep in wolf's clothing. The Arctic is changing. If you look at post-colonial politics in Greenland, that will change if there are movements of secession from the Kingdom of Denmark. Denmark's no longer an Arctic power. So the map has the potential to change. But more importantly, I think while we're looking at the uptick in military exercises, symbolic, important for alliance cohesion as they are, I think we also need not to miss the political economy on which Russia is built. So I'll stop there.
That's fantastic, Caroline. Thank you so much. We'll now turn to our third speaker, Dr. Marc Lanteigne. Dr. Lanteigne is an associate professor in political science at the University of Tromsø in Norway, where he researches extensively on the politics and foreign policy of China, including its Arctic foreign policy and regional relations. This is part of a much broader interest that Dr. Lanteigne has in Asia and the Arctic more generally. Dr. Lanteigne, over to you, please.
Hey, thank you very much to the organizers, excellencies, and honored guests. It's a pleasure to be here. Talking about what China's Arctic policy is starting to evolve into, it's been interesting to see what kind of policies have taken shape since China published its watershed Arctic white paper in January of 2018. In many ways, there's still a bit of a watch and wait approach, not only from those looking at China's Arctic policy from the outside, but also within China itself. And you can see this kind of feeling when you look at the three existing pillars of what China's Arctic policy has evolved into. The first of these, and this is still, I believe, going to be a major focus of China's activities in the far north, is the question of scientific diplomacy. There's a great deal of interest now as to how the Arctic, especially in regards to environmental change, is going to affect China either directly or indirectly, in regards to changed weather patterns within China itself, as regards to changes in pollution, and more to the point, how this might affect China's ongoing interest in becoming a rising economic power. So there has been still a great deal of discussion about increasing scientific cooperation with Arctic states, and we're especially seeing this in the case of Russia. And it's also understood that if China is going to be accepted as an Arctic stakeholder, that it's the need for China to demonstrate not only its scientific prowess, but scientific interest in the Arctic is still considered to be extremely important. Now, the second pillar, and this is the one that is currently getting most of the attention, has to do with economics and trade and potential investment. China has made it very clear that non-Arctic states have the right to engage in economic activities in the far north, as long as they are consistent with country and international law. And up until the onset of the pandemic, there were many signs that China was seeking to expand its economic interests in the Arctic, a lot of which under the aegis of the Polar Silk Road. Now, since that was formulated, I would say in 2017, much of the discussion about how the Belt and Road was going to expand into the Arctic had to do with cooperation with Russia. And we've heard quite a bit about the Yamal liquefied natural gas project and great interest in developing the Northern Sea route as a secondary trading route between Northeast Asia and Europe. But one question which is still yet to be determined is whether the Polar Silk Road will expand outside of Russia. Certainly, if you look at maps of the proposed route, there doesn't seem to be a very significant endpoint. And it's already been demonstrated that China is looking ahead to the time, which could be as early as 15 years from now, where it may be possible to send cargo vessels right over the North Pole in certain parts of summer. Here in northern Norway, that possibility is getting quite a bit of attention. There is the idea that perhaps we will start to see expansions of ports and expansions of transportation facilities, railways, and so forth in the Nordic Arctic. And there's also quite a bit of discussion about when China will be interested in sending cargo vessels through the Northwest Passage in northern Canada. it has been suggested that China is trying to develop, again, a role as an Arctic partner to Arctic economies, to demonstrate that it is interested in having a role in the economic expansion and development of the Arctic. But as I'm going to be explaining, that particular approach does have its share of detractors. Now, the third pillar, and this is one which is still in the kind of building process, has to do with growing questions about Arctic governance. At the moment, we have some pretty straightforward approaches to that. We have the Arctic Council, we have various legal institutions such as the Law of the Sea. China has made it very clear that it is not interested in challenging those particular norms and laws. But you have the question, first of all, about what happens in the hallways, not in the meeting rooms, but in the hallways, about how China might be in a position to start to influence dialogue about Arctic governance. And the second point is, well, what is going to happen when we start to see an expansion of interest in the Arctic to the point where new regimes, new laws, or even norms are created? Beijing has made it very clear that as these dialogues continue, China wants to be considered a part of that process. Let's just say if it has to do with new rules regarding shipping or new rules regarding safety, search and rescue. But at the same time, Beijing has stressed that it is not seeking to overturn the existing legal, if you will, framework in the region. Now, what's happening next? Well, one big question, which I'll touch on very briefly, is how US-China relations, which obviously are heading into a difficult patch right now, might influence how the two countries cooperate or don't in the Arctic. Now, certainly we've seen a very interesting approach by the previous government over how China should be interpreted as an Arctic player. We have seen, unfortunately, to the detriment of the possibility of cooperation between the two countries, the very common effect of the previous government in Washington of looking at so-called dogs that didn't bark. There were, for example, attempts to draw a straight line of causality between the situation in the South China Sea and the Arctic, despite the fact that we were dealing with considerably different geographical, historical, legal, and political effects. There's also been an attempt to kind of jump ahead of the game and automatically assume a military agenda on China's part in the Arctic. For example, with a focus on supposed submarine activity. That was a very common statement made by certain US officials to suggest that we are already seeing Chinese submarine activity, but very little in the way of follow-up. And third, overall, we saw an attempt to essentially frame China as a revisionist state. And again, very, very light on details, especially considering that Beijing has tried very hard to express itself as a supporter for Arctic regimes, both traditional ones like the Arctic Council and newer initiatives such as the Polar Code. Also, certain policies undertaken by the previous US government regarding the Arctic. The Pompeo speech of 2019 was already mentioned, and that particular speech was not shy about pointing to China as an interloper in the Arctic. Also, the issue over the US proposal to potentially buy Greenland, despite the fact that it was in contravention of the 2009 self-rule agreement between Denmark and Greenland itself. Both of these were considered costly signals, suggesting that the United States was taking on a more zero-sum game in the region. And that certainly created problems for the possibility of China-US cooperation. And certainly there is quite a bit of common ground which could and should be looked at, especially in the area of Arctic climate change. So final point, I also do want to suggest though that there are certain areas of Arctic security involving China that should be given a great deal of focus. One, which has been brought up quite a bit, is the possibility of dual use projects, including China's interest, for example, in maritime exploration as well as monitoring. The idea of whether these kinds of projects could have both civilian and military uses. And finally, we go back to the issue of how to best accommodate China in the emerging world of Arctic governance, because we certainly have not heard the last word on the subject. China has made it very clear that it does not want to be a revisionist power in the Arctic, but it also does not want to be left behind as the Arctic continues to grow as an area of governance. So the last question, which I'll leave everyone with, is to what degree now can the Arctic be considered an international space in terms of the interests of non-Arctic states? And what roles can and should China play in that developing international space? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lanteigne. That was excellent. A really nice balanced overview there, I think, of the complicated relationship that the Arctic and China have. So just before we turn to our next speaker, I just wanted to say for the Q&A that will follow our panel, the process will be for everyone to post their questions in the chat. And you are welcome to start posting those questions whenever you like, and then I will start to take those after we've heard our final speaker. But for now then, we'll turn to our fourth speaker, Dr. Andreas Raspotnik, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Fridtjof Nansen Center, a Senior Researcher at the High North Center at Nord University, and a Senior Fellow at the Arctic Institute. And despite having all those jobs, he also managed to write the book on the European Union and the geopolitics of the Arctic. So we couldn't think of anyone better to bring an EU perspective to today's webinar. So Dr. Raspotnik, the floor is yours.
Vielen Dank, Duncan. Hi from the Arctic country of Austria. I'm here in home office, so it's still very snowy here in Austria and very wintry. More winter than up in northern Norway. Mark will know about that. To all the students out there and all the titles and affiliations Duncan just mentioned, fake it till you make it. I think that's a good starting point for all the youngsters out there. Yeah, thanks again for inviting me, and thanks again for giving me the chance to talk a bit about the European Union in the Arctic. I always feel like the odd one out when it comes to these issues, because it's not as sexy as China in the Arctic or Russia's militarization efforts in the Arctic or the US. But I think, of course, from my point of view, it's a very interesting topic, the European Union in the Arctic. Whenever I do research now in the EU in the Arctic, I come back to a statement I found while doing my PhD a while ago. That was from former Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs, and as my colleagues in Norway say, maybe the next Prime Minister in Norway, Jonas Gahr Støre, who said in 2012, geography is changing even though we cannot change geography. I think that it's a very nice summary of what's going on in the Arctic and who is like kind of governing the Arctic, but also like how international awareness on the Arctic is increasing. And of course, we're all a bit aware of that the European Union is an Arctic actor and has been doing quite a lot on Arctic issues. Meetings like that are very timely because there will be a new joint communication, how this policy update will be called, this autumn, published and issued by the European Commission and the High Representative. We have seen a new ambassador taking over, or special envoy, whatever you want to call him. Not that new anymore, over a year ago, Michael Mann. You had a consultation process the European Commission launched. You currently have an overview project that looks at the different policies, EU policies, and how they positively and negatively affect the Arctic. European member states are quite active when it comes to at least publishing documents on Arctic issues. You had Germany, you had France, you had Sweden recently with an Arctic strategy. Finland will publish a new one. Estonia has applied for Arctic Council observer status, and Poland, I think, is also preparing a polar paper, a polar strategy. So there are a few things going on in that matter. And as Elisabeth will know, there's the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung together with Andreas Raspotnik and me. We're also working on a few papers on how the Nordics perceive the European Union's Arctic ideas. So that's just like the, the big frame, the big umbrella I want to start with. When it comes to the EU and the Arctic, I mean, I want to start with a few things that might be a bit boring and abstract to a lot of you, but I think they're very important because it says a lot about who the European Union is and who the various actors are, what kind of audience we deal with, etc. So when we talk about the European Union, when you talk about the new joint communication that will be published, I think, again, it's very technical, maybe very academic in a way, but I think it's important to understand that this is first and foremost in the beginning a paper by the European Commission and the High Representative, so the External Action Service. And later on, the European Parliament and the Council, meaning the member states, will kind of have their comments on that paper. But again, it's not a fully fledged EU document. It's a document by two institutions. and they bring together the various voices, especially the Commission, on what, you know, this Arctic strategy or Arctic policy, it's more like a policy update, could be on 15, 20 pages. And we're all aware, Marc has been working with China and others, you know, on how complex not only the Arctic issues are, but also like how these papers need to bring everything together. When it comes to the EU and the Arctic, very internal point of view is what we have seen over the last 10 years is that there has been not only a growing awareness, but more and more knowledge on what's happening in the Arctic, especially in the Commission and the External Action Service. So you have like very knowledgeable people currently working on Arctic issues, but nevertheless, the Arctic is still a niche in Brussels. Like there are not a lot of people working on that issues, and a lot of people in various DGs and various departments within the Commission, they don't have the Arctic on the agenda, although they work in Arctic related issues, be it, for example, space issues or something. So you have this internal, the lack of internal awareness of what the EU could do in the Arctic and of what kind of actor the EU is in the Arctic. And similar, the same is also when it comes to the external awareness of, like, you know, what kind of role could the EU play when it comes to Arctic governance or other things. And I think this is particularly relevant for the topic we're discussing today, security. I mean, we have a lot of Europeans here, and we're all aware that when we talk about security and military aspects in Europe, we're a bit like, you know, we don't feel comfortable often to talk about that. And I think in the EU perspective, especially based on the EU's history, on the competences the supranational body actually have on security, there are a lot of people out there that think the EU per se, so the level above the member states, should not have a role to play when it comes to matters of security. And I think we also see that in the Arctic. Although when you look back, you know, early 90s, the first European steps into the north, into the Arctic, were very much security, soft security related though. I mean, it was all about Barents cooperation and relationship with Russia. The northern dimension was very much related on how to bring the north not only closer to Europe, but also like the northwest of Europe closer to the northwest of Russia closer to Europe. So we have some kind of history when it comes to security issues. I mean, also in other like recent strategies, when it comes to maritime security strategy, the global strategy of 2016 very prominently emphasized on Arctic issues, talked about selective engagement with Russia and using the Arctic as one of these, one of the areas of selective engagement. And of course, like the usual suspects of keeping the Arctic a peaceful area and a peaceful place of collaboration. So in a way, security as such is very much a soft policy issues in the Arctic, and we should not forget the Arctic or the EU is all about competences and treaties, and nothing in the treaties indicate that the EU should protect the Arctic or how the EU should protect the Arctic. So the Arctic is not mentioned in the treaties. Again, it's only like a little thing, but I think it's very important to keep that in mind when we talk about what the EU could do and what the EU should do in the Arctic. Also, there's no distinct budget line for the Arctic. So you try to bring all different aspects, all different policies that kind of have an Arctic, you know, field in it, you try to bring them together. And I think that's the bit of the tricky part right now. When it comes to the EU and the Arctic, then I think the important point is it only about the Arctic, or is it about what also Marc and others mentioned about global developments that have an effect on the Arctic? And of course, it relates to relationships between the EU and China, but essentially, of course, it's everything. It's all about the EU and Russia. And there we tackle some interesting points of discussions here, like which we could discuss now later on. It's different aspects of security. I mean, again, you have this very hard security point of view, military aspects, etc. But when it comes to the EU in the Arctic, I would say, I would put an emphasis maybe on energy security. And then we may talk about the Arctic, but then we talk about different aspects here. We talk about Nord Stream 2, we talk about where Elisabeth sits, you know, the Baltic's perspective on the EU and Russia and the EU. So it's the Arctic is maybe just like the starting point of broader discussions. We also talk, I mentioned before, space issues, you know, and the technical capabilities the EU and EU projects could bring to the Arctic. Maritime security, which kind of like all plays into that, you know, ocean governance aspects and how the EU is like, you know, a global player, the global player when it comes to environmental protection issues, sustainable development, and then again to, I'm often referring to Marc here, but like to new aspects of Arctic governance, you know, and like what could, or how could the Arctic maybe be discussed in fora outside the Arctic. And I think these are all like interesting points we could take on in the discussion, like different aspects of security as such. I think for the EU and the upcoming joint communication, there is like a bit of a change that you want to bring in more geopolitics and more discussion on security. The question, I think, or the challenge for the External Action Service and the High Representative and the European Commission is here, like to find a very nuanced language on securitization of the Arctic and what security means for the Arctic, also from a European point of view, especially because of the history, the competences, also the Arctic history of the EU, and like trying to be like, you know, as trying to not to like you know step on somebody's foot up there, like be it like some Arctic states or non-Arctic states. I think I'll stop from here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Raspotnik. That was very interesting. We are now going to turn to our last speaker, our esteemed guest from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Mr. Jens Jägermanis, who serves as the Director of the European Department. And Mr. Jägermanis has been a diplomat for over 25 years and has also served in that time as Latvia's ambassador to 2 Arctic states, Sweden and Denmark, as well as spending time working in the Latvian embassy in Russia in the 1990s. And so Mr. Jägermanis has kindly agreed to essentially kickstart our discussion today by offering his view on what we've heard so far. So Mr. Jägermanis, over to you.
Yes, hello, good afternoon. I will begin with a joke. Since we're talking about the Arctic, I do not want to pretend that I am a great expert on the Arctic issues. And the joke would be that I've been once beyond the polar circle in places like Kiruna and Jokkmokk. So that's my Arctic experience, so to say, or polar experience. But if we are a bit more serious about these issues, then I should state a few facts and make some points. First, a few years ago, back in Stockholm, I was taking part in a discussion on Russia in the Nordic framework, and the discussion was taking place at famous institute, SIPRI, and most of the panelists were suggesting that, I mean, Russia is behaving sort of in a different way in the Arctic region, and they placed high hopes for dialogue there. And I became a bit impatient and suggested that we cannot distinguish Russia in the Arctic and Russia in Syria or Ukraine for that matter. It's the same country, and it has very clear strategic and regional goals. That would be one point. And the other is I'm coming from Latvia, and Latvian voice has not been heard so far on the Arctic matters. Though Latvian Minister of Foreign Affairs a couple of years ago went to Umeå, a city in Sweden, and he took part in a regional European Union conference on High North and Arctic matters, and we at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we were kind of puzzled what for, or why our minister went there. And in the past couple of years, we have been trying to understand our role in this area. we have been mapping our interests, our possibilities to contribute, and I can say we are at the very early stages. And yet, the Minister of Foreign Affairs a couple of weeks ago at the foreign policy debate at Parliament in Riga, he stated that Latvia should prepare an application of non-observer country to the Arctic Council. It means that in the coming years, Latvian voice will be heard on these matters. We are stepping on this floor, being mindful of that this region is having legal and institutional framework, as well as Andreas just mentioned. We are going to play it very carefully, so that we would not step on someone's toes, since we are not a major player in these issues. We are, I could say, at the age of toddler. We are just taking first few immature steps, and we would like to learn a lot. And one of the aims would be to establish a permanent dialogue especially with our Nordic neighbors, and try to engage in debates and discussion on the Arctic issues. And one last point I would like to mention is that I'm grateful to Elisabeth that she launched this discussion that we're having today, because I think we need these debates in Riga in particular, and in the Baltic area, because we have been used to debate the Baltic security of the Baltic region mostly, and we lack experience and discussions on the developments in the Arctic region. I hope that in the coming couple of years we will be able to establish a kind of forum in Riga where we could discuss both the Baltic security and the Arctic security matters. So I think I will stop here and enjoy discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jegemanis. That was a really interesting take there to explain how Latvia's interest is still, you know, at a relatively low base, but evolving very, very quickly in this space. And I think all of us here will be very interested to hear more of what is to come as you develop your understanding and own ideas about how Latvia can best contribute to the region. Okay, so we will now move on to our discussion, and I can see that questions have been appearing in the chat. So I'm going to try and keep track of that now and bring these into the discussion. We have a mix here of some thematic questions and some very, very specific questions. So what I will do is I will throw the questions out, and I think in most cases we will see which panelist might like to respond. And I think the easiest way for you to do that, panel, is just to jump in, and then we will organize accordingly. So the first question that we have is from Aditya Parikh. Apologies if I pronounced that wrong, but asking a question about the Arctic Search and Rescue Agreement, and whether this is sort of fit for purpose in terms of the increasing traffic along the NSR. And Aditya has pointed out that a recent assessment from last year by IHS Markit flagged up that the Arctic, Russia and Bering Sea are a region where the second highest number of fatalities among seafarers are happening. So clearly there is a discussion point there about whether more is needed in terms of Arctic search and rescue. Is there anyone who'd like to come back to Aditya on that question?
So Duncan, if I could just jump in, and you probably know better than I, sorry, it's Caroline. Hasn't this become something that many of the Arctic states are addressing, in the sense of the Canadians, for example, diverted an icebreaker, I believe, you know, to try and help ferries and those vessels which had found it very, very difficult with the crunching up of sea ice off the Canadian coast. So I think we're aware that there are dangers, particularly in late spring, when sea ice, you know, makes it very difficult to navigate. So I think this points to the importance of cooperation and coordination in the Arctic, but yes, hugely hazardous and growing more so.
Thank you, Caroline. Did anyone else want to come in on that question about the Arctic Search and Rescue Agreement?
I wouldn't mind, Duncan, if you don't mind.
Yes, please do.
Thank you. I think the Arctic SAR agreement is a pledge of cooperation, and it has been a focal point of the work of the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, which was established in 2015. The chair of the Arctic Coast Guard Forum rotates in coordination with the chair of the Arctic Council, so Iceland has been chairing it, and it will be passed to Russia this spring as well. The Arctic Coast Guard Forum has successfully executed live exercises every other year, and they've done tabletop exercises in the intervening years, so there's strong and robust cooperation through that group. The Coast Guard Forum has also developed a code of conduct and has practiced communications exercises. So I think we've seen a tremendous amount of progress in cooperation on search and rescue in the Arctic region, but I would also observe that most of the coastal maritime traffic will be the responsibility of the coastal state. And so to a certain extent, if there's a hazard with shipping in the Northern Sea Route, for example, Russia will be the first responder. And so their increasing national capabilities is first and foremost the responsibility of the coastal state that is seeking to develop Arctic shipping. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. And just sticking with that, just sticking with you on this, because we've actually had several questions about the maritime aspects in the Arctic, and I wonder if I kind of just bundle some of these together, and perhaps you could offer a reflection on some of these. So there's interest in the chat, first of all, in whether the what is the significance of a transpolar sea route in the kind of the 15+ year time frame? Is this going to change which cities and ports are the most strategic locations to benefit, or will it be the sort of the same cities and ports? Related to that, we also have a question about the undersea dimension and the laying of fiber optic cables, particularly along the NSR. And again, whether this is significant enough to constitute something that in strategic terms matters, or whether this is more localized. And then thirdly, riding on the back of that, do we actually want to see this level of expansion in maritime activity, whether that's relating to port expansion or development of cargo routes, or should it be that we should be encouraging that the Arctic is actually protected from that kind of scale of maritime activity?
I'll lead off. Those are three substantial questions, so I'll do my best. I think the transpolar route is interesting because it would cut across the small donut hole of high seas in the central Arctic Ocean, and so that certainly changes the nature of maritime shipping. Although I would note that the transpolar route is very distant from any place of refuge, repair, resupply, and the region remains poorly charted and full of hazards. Even if there is, even if the ice cover is reduced, there are likely to still be floating ice hazards, bad weather, icing, significant challenges with communications at high latitudes. there's certainly going to be refreezing going on in the wintertime. So we would only see a very narrow window of navigation possible in the late summer. And it's going to be very challenging. I think we have not seen an explosion in Arctic shipping in the last few years, despite Russia's efforts, because it remains a very difficult operational project. And Arctic shipping is so plagued with challenges that it's not suitable for the just-in-time model that dominates global maritime commerce. So it's really going to be a very niche market, I would think, for the foreseeable future. Fiber optic cables, there's a couple, and Mark, I might kick this over to you because I know Chinese investment is backing one of them, and then there's another project, I think, linking Japan and Russia. So there are a couple different projects underway, and that's, that raises questions about security, obviously, but it also bringing connectivity, particularly to remote northern communities, is a really important part of economic development. And so those are some of the difficult questions that I think are being asked right now. The last question about whether this is good or bad is obviously sort of a normative question, but I do think that we must bear in mind behind all of this, as we speak about the Arctic opening and all of this economic potential, we're witnessing a catastrophic environmental outcome. And, it's important to bear in mind that if we're going to stay at 1.5 degrees, there's questions, I think, about how much of this should or will be pushed forward, right? I don't know what the Arctic will look like if we can stay at 1.5, but it may be that some of these projections will not be materialized. And this will be the backdrop of just wrenching environmental destruction, loss of unique species, challenges to the way of life of Arctic communities. And that's a very difficult thing that I think is important to bear in mind behind these discussions. I'll stop there and see if anyone else wants to weigh in. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Mark, do you have anything to add from a China perspective on that?
Yes, thank you. On the subject of the Central Arctic, yes. I guess the two questions which would need to be answered before we look at that kind of prediction would be, first of all, as was just noted, at what point are maritime transits through the Central Arctic viable, not only in terms of logistics, but also economically? But the second question is, what exactly would be shipped in the region and who would take the lead in developing that particular route? Now, there's been some very good studies recently about China's interest in the Central Arctic route. And China has made it very clear that once that route comes open, it does see it as part of the expanding Polar Silk Road. But we do have the question of what exactly would be shipped. Yes, a just-in-time model would be extremely difficult. But on the other hand, let's say hypothetically, we start to see significant mining operations commence in Greenland, let's say 10 years from now. That would obviously cause a shift in shipping priorities. And one other point there, speaking from a Northern Norwegian viewpoint, one of the reasons why there is some enthusiasm here about developing ports and transportation to potentially connect to the Polar Silk Road is the idea that there's a limited window of opportunity. That if we start to see the Central Arctic open up, well, other parts of the Arctic might be considered more viable, that the Nordic region would simply be bypassed in favor of, let's say, Iceland or Greenland. So there's a lot of maybes that are currently floating around. And there's also the idea that we shouldn't be left out when the opportunities arrive. Very quickly on the cable. Yes, a subsidiary of Huawei Marine, which has since been spun off and separated and rebought, was seen as a potential major player for the Arctic data link. And that certainly caused a lot of question, not only because of China, but also because of Russia's involvement about data security. China has been very interested in developing a digital Silk Road, and certainly we do see the Arctic as part of those plans. And certainly there's been a lot of discussion, including by the Finnish and Icelandic chairs of the Arctic Council, about the need for better communications and data in the Arctic, especially growing demand for remote learning. But how that is going to be reconciled with the question of data security, that's going to be important. And it's also going to be very key to figure out, okay, who exactly has oversight of a project this ambitious?
Thank you, Mark. That's great. Andreas, I'm going to turn to you now because we've had a question specifically about the EU. And this is in relation to Greenland, which obviously is not part of the EU. And the question is, given that we know about the US interest in Greenland, we know about Chinese interest in Greenland, how much interest is there in the EU in Greenland? And should it be doing more in terms of investing in the island?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a tricky point of view because, as everybody knows, Greenland was part of the European community until back in the 80s. It's now not part of the EU, is very much connected to the EU. So first of all, of course, the legal part, the regulations, the acquis communautaire is not, or it's not subject to the acquis, but has this partnership agreement when it comes to fisheries and other issues. But I think it kind of sometimes stops there. You know, if you look back into almost 13 years, 12 years of EU Arctic policy making, Greenland has been there. I remember the parliament was a bit more pushy towards Greenland in 2012. I remember very funny stories, or very funny discussions on like, we have to be there before China is in Greenland. But I think that kind of has stopped a bit. And I think Greenland is one of these points where, when you talk about an EU strategy or an EU idea about the Arctic and what they should do in the Arctic, it's not very well tackled, because sometimes I think that this broad idea of what Greenland could, how Greenland could be, not even what Greenland could bring to the EU, but how Greenland could, you know, play an essential role for all kind of aspects when it comes to energy security, raw materials, or whatever. This discussion is not there yet on an EU level. I think that there's still a lot of things that can be discussed. Again, you see this very, you know, popular points on Greenland, but I think if you go more in depth, that's a bit lacking, at least to my understanding. But then again, you have this partnerships agreement on fisheries and other agreements there, where you have very practical collaboration going on already.
Thank you, Andreas. Did anyone else want to come in on that question before we move on? Jens, I see you've got your hand up. Did you want to come in?
Yes. Although Andreas covered it fairly well, and it was a correct observation, I would like to add one additional point. As I have served as ambassador to Denmark, I noticed a couple of things during my first few years from 2009. Each January, Greenland is organizing a meeting for ambassadors residing in Copenhagen, and you go to these meetings, and they explain what has been going on for the past year on their island. And then when China really started to make some very important steps, trying to discuss the options of making some work on gas and other minerals in Greenland, Danish government all of a sudden woke up, and it has become a very important issue for Copenhagen. So when we talk about European Union and Greenland, we should bear in mind that this is a territory of Denmark, even though it is regulated somewhat differently in relation to the European Union.
Thank you for that. Excellent. Right. Sorry for my stuttering here. I'm just trying to get back to the question panel now, because I'm operating on a single tablet here. Okay, so the next question that we have here is about how are Arctic states preparing for a potential oil spill, or I guess any similar sort of accident involving spillage at high latitudes, which would have severe consequences for Arctic ecosystems and also human communities, of course, that live in the area. Becca, did you want to come in on that one?
Sure. I'll note that the Arctic states have also signed the Marine Oil Spill Prevention Agreement. I believe that was 2011 or 2013. The MOSPA agreement is also something that both the Coast Guard Forum, the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, discusses and works on, as well as the EPPR group in the Arctic Council, so Environmental Protection and Pollution Response. And so EPPR has exercised live exercises in furtherance of MOSPA, and there's a I would say a very robust amount of work going on through both the Arctic Council and the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. Again, oil spills are, the first responder will be the coastal nation, and so to a certain extent, that's there'll be some variation in national legislation and authorities. So we have sort of different response agreements in place. In the United States, for example, it's a polluter pays principle. And there are also, so for shippers, IMO regulations and some of the global agreements on marine pollution apply. So there's both a global structure of regulations aimed at preventing oil spills, as well as a variety of national legislation. And so I think to a certain extent, we have the tools in place in terms of the agreements and regulations. Obviously, the Polar Code that was put into place a few years ago is a big step forward there. To a certain extent, though, there's just a level of difficulty. It's impossible to get oil off of ice. If the oil gets under the ice, we simply don't have the technology at this point. And so I think continuing to develop technology and continuing to make sure we're taking all of the preventative approaches to foreclose the possibility of some kind of spill are really the top priorities.
Thank you, Rebecca. Did anyone else want to come in on that question about how Arctic states are preparing for a potential spill? No? Okay, well, we'll move on then to the next question. I mean, we've got lots to get through here. So
can I say something?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, can I quickly say something on that?
Yes, of course.
I thought you saw me waiting. No, I want to bring in something maybe a bit more of a future-oriented or an abstract thought on that. You know, I mean, we all love numbers. So I sometimes think, at least for me, it would be interesting to have some numbers out there. How much would it actually cost, you know, to clean a major oil spill? And as Becca said, you know, who would pay for that and who is responsible for that? You don't want to, like, you know, you can't predict the future, but I wonder if a big oil spill happened in the Arctic, you know, I sometimes, as I understand Europe, of how we work and how we think in very general terms of the Arctic, I think an oil spill could be a Fukushima moment for Europe. You know, an oil spill in the Arctic could definitely shift Arctic debate in Europe, and then nobody would talk about, you know, big regional development issues in the Arctic, but then it will be all like at least a public discussion about how to protect the Arctic, and let's, you know, have moratorium on X, Y, and Z and everything, and we shut down the Arctic. And I think it's very abstract discussion, but I think the thought could be interesting to always keep that in mind, you know, of what such a potential oil spill will actually do or will do, at least in my understanding, to Europe or to other countries' understanding of the future of the Arctic.
Thank you for that, Andreas. I think that's a very very interesting observation there, and a fair point to make. Okay, so we'll turn to our next question now, which I'm going to direct this to you, Caroline, in the first instance, but I think everyone will probably want to jump in on this. And it's a more conceptual question, and I'm just going to read it out as it's been written. Which is that when we speak of climate change and ecological issues, we tend to categorize them under the larger ambit of non-traditional security. However, with the Anthropocene being evident, where do we draw the line between traditional and non-traditional security? Since climate change is the primary concern in the Arctic, where do we place the Arctic in this framework of understanding security?
Goodness, what a great question. So for the students of security studies, out there that, of course, in the old days, people of my generation would do strategic studies, which was literally the study of Rob Hubert's in the audience. He knows this, of nuclear weapons. And we used to gameplay all the time what a nuclear exchange might look like in the Arctic or anywhere else. And it's a very, very important question because, you know, some estimates say that the Arctic Ocean will be the most nuclearized place on the planet by, you know, 2040. So how should we conceptualize it? I think I would, of course, say this. I would say we need to look at the lessons of the Cold War and how even in 1962 and again in 1983, we avoided direct nuclear confrontation. But I do think some of the more critical security studies, some of the softer security issues do have to be meshed in. We have to have a multi-approach to conceptualizing security in the Arctic. And I think what I tried in my short presentation to point to was that the Arctic is inhabited. We do have a human dimension in the Arctic, which is allied to political economy, which of course rests also on conceptions of security. So I would say hard security has a lot to offer in terms of understanding the guns and ammo, the nuclear weapons system and the capabilities. But we also need soft security, if we can call it that, approaches, precisely because we're all human and it's all about intent as well as capabilities. And I think what Becca's done brilliantly this afternoon is point us to the way in which Arctic states, various governments, no one wants war in the Arctic. It would be ludicrous. So we need to find ways, and perhaps it is through a softer security lens to think about what brings us together in terms of a global security and a regional security. And that is existence, of course, and survivability, but also ensuring that the Arctic remains a place of not just, you know, confrontation, but human habitation. And I do think there have been encouraging signs that all Arctic states, and I'd include Russia in this, have looked to promote indigenous people, communities, smart Arctics that bring people together. So it's a difficult question, but a hugely important one. So not to sidestep the issue, but to say perhaps it is time, and the Arctic might give us the laboratory to all start talking to each other about, you know, the hard security issues of diplomacy and balancing and weapons systems, and actually what climate change, environmental politics and human politics means for developing good governance norms in the region. And that's something we haven't talked about because norms governance will become increasingly important as the Arctic melts. So I hope that's okay, Duncan.
Yeah, that's terrific, Caroline. Did anyone else want to come back on Caroline's point there? Okay, well,
that was so beautifully done.
Oh, go on, Becca.
I was just going to say that was so beautifully done. I would, I wouldn't like to try to go after such a elegant summation. Thank you.
Well, can I add to the elegance? Thank you. Of throwing in, Duncan, I saw a question in the chat about the Antarctica Treaty, and one of the issues here is out to 2048. It seems to me wearing my heart of darkness. It's going to be very difficult to keep that treaty going. It's going to be very difficult to stop great power competition in that preserve. And I think there are already signs, New Zealand, Australia, China, I mean, Mark will know better than anyone, the UK. The circling is beginning to happen over this hugely important area. And I think we need not regard it as pristine and a place that will not necessarily be violated, because already the signs are that many states are beginning to look at what their position will be once that treaty comes to an end.
Well, we'll stick with the Antarctic Treaty question. And what I'll do, I've got 3 more questions on my list that I think we can squeeze in. And I'm going to direct one of those to Andreas, one to Rebecca, and one to Mark. And then Caroline, you will get a final word at the end. But I'm going to tell you what the questions are now so that you can be thinking about them so that we can make sure we can squeeze all the answers in before we get to the hour. So, Andreas, on the point about the Antarctic Treaty, and I direct this to you because this is exactly where the EU seems to become unstuck before. Should we have an Antarctic Treaty for the Arctic? Marc, what do you make of the Christophe de Margery's recent voyage from Yamal to China? Is this as groundbreaking as it sounds? Is this like the planting of the Russian flag in 2007? Are we about to see the resumption of hype and frenzy about the coming age of the Arctic and how this is going to change everything? And then lastly, Rebecca, a military question for you, which is, do you think there's any prospect of Greenland moving from out of EUCOM and into US Northcom's area of responsibility? Andreas, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Hard to say. I mean, if you remember that there were ideas, very early ideas back in 2008 and 2009, especially in the European Parliament, about an Arctic treaty similar to the Antarctic Treaty System. And that was, of course, not very well perceived by Arctic states. And I remember every time I talk to former politicians here in Norway that have been in charge during that time, they you know, when I say I'm working on EU Arctic issues, they said, yeah, remember what they have done in the early days. They talked about the Arctic Treaty. And there was a lot of, lobbying from the Norwegian side. So I don't think, and again, as a researcher, I need to be careful sometimes what I say, but I don't think there's a need for a treaty. But I think it's interesting to have discussions on keeping in mind that the Arctic Council is not the holy grail of everything in the Arctic, and there might be other fora used by other actors to discuss Arctic issues. And I'm not only looking at the European Union, but maybe at Marc and about China, and how the Arctic could be discussed outside the Arctic Council, and how prepared are Arctic states for that. Again, also when it comes to circumstances or events we can predict, or different audiences taking over the narrative and taking over the discussion, it could all shift into a different direction. Arctic states may not perceive as important right now. So I think there's no need for an Arctic treaty, but I think it's always, especially from an academic and research point of view, interesting to discuss what other fora are out there, and not only the Arctic Council.
Thank you, Andreas. And now, Marc, I'll turn to you for the question about the Christophe de Margery.
Yes, okay, I'd say that voyage is groundbreaking in the sense that it is part of the interests of both Russia and China to standardize the idea of Arctic shipping becoming routine. There's still the general perception that this is kind of an experiment, that we are just trying to test the waters, for lack of a better term, to try to determine, okay, what is and is not viable in terms of successful shipping. But I think this voyage, first of all, it underscores the fact that China is quite serious about being an economic player in the region, and that maritime shipping, including the development of the Polar Silk Road, will be very key here. So I think I would look at it as groundbreaking in terms of a very important stepping stone to a larger move towards standardizing China's presence in the Arctic, as well as making Arctic shipping just another day at the office, so to speak. And one quick note about the Arctic Treaty concept. Two very complicated subjects that also have to be discussed. First of all, there's no particular agreement as to where the Arctic begins and ends. Like, each Arctic state has its own view of where the Arctic frontier is, so that creates a problem right there. But more to the point, as soon as you start talking about an Arctic treaty, you talk about the very tricky question of the sovereignty of Arctic states versus non-Arctic states. And that is something which the Arctic Council has had to wrestle with. We now have 13 country observers, with potentially 2 more, Estonia and Ireland. And then you get to the question of, okay, how should sovereignty shift between the Arctic states and non-Arctic states in light of the opening of the Arctic? And that is a very tricky question.
Thank you, Marc. Right, we'll turn then to Rebecca for the question about Greenland again.
I would be surprised if the UCP lines changed for a couple of reasons. Northcom is very much focused on homeland defense. It does quite a good amount of defense support to civil authorities. And so it has a very sort of US and Canada focus, and the homeland defense elements, the DISCA missions, I think it would be a little bit harder to adjust those to Greenland. Also, Greenland is a part of the Kingdom of Denmark, and Denmark is firmly within EUCOM. And so I think that would, moving that line would create a fair amount of discomfort. I will say that I think there is a recognition within DoD that the convergence of the COCOMs in the Arctic, it's not just EUCOM and NORTHCOM, but Indo-PACOM on the Western Arctic has some important equities as well, creates a seams and gaps issue that has been getting a fair amount of attention. And there's discussion about how to resolve that. There's currently some interest in centralizing Arctic equities within the Department of Defense through something like a DASD Arctic. There's been some discussion of sort of a Joint Task Force North type construct. And so I think there's attention being paid to this issue, but I also, I wouldn't see a major shift like that COCOM shift coming underway anytime soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Caroline, any last thoughts from you?
Sorry, Duncan. I suppose reflecting on the very fine presentations this afternoon from our guests and colleagues and the wealth of questions, the Arctic is fairly obviously a place that we all find fascinating. And I wonder, when we're reflecting on the Arctic, you know, in terms of taking our research agenda ahead, it was exactly the point that you started with. Can we separate the Arctic off, as many of us have been guilty of doing, as this place apart, or do we really now need to think of it as connected? And my thought is, you know, we're in Brexit now. Sorry about that, Andreas. No longer in the EU. What can I say? Isn't it interesting that many of the states and groups play out many of their national ambitions in the Arctic, which they haven't done, but I think they will in the south of the world. So I suppose my question would be, Duncan, we all find the Arctic endlessly fascinating. And perhaps the next phase should be about why. I mean, I do think intellectually it's very, very interesting, because we haven't even talked on the, and I know Ingrid's in the audience, the rich cultural heritage of the Arctic and, you know, what it has to offer us in terms of its politics. So I'll end it there, Duncan.
Some very nice points there, Caroline. Jens, did you have any final thoughts of your own before I hand back to Elisabeth?
Thank you. No, I appreciate opportunity to be part of this, and I'm glad, even though we look at screens, it has to do with Riga somehow. Thank you, Elisabeth. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, and just to echo that, you know, thank you to all of our panel today for fantastic presentations. You can see in the comments as well that there's been a lot of interest today, and I think people have taken a lot from the discussion. I'd also like to thank all of our guests who've taken time out their day to be part of this meeting, and for all of your questions. I think I covered them all. I'm sorry if there were any that I missed, but I'm sure I speak on behalf of the panel if I say that they would welcome you getting in touch with them directly if there were any specific issues that you would like to pick up with them. So with that, I will hand back to Elisabeth.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you to all of our guest speakers. And I have to say, this is one of the good things with the pandemic and going online, because this lot probably wouldn't have had over here for just for a 2-hour session. But we're all of us looking forward to have something in present later on when it will be possible again to meet each other. I hope it will be a start, especially because if there's any more question, any more support which we could give to the Foreign Ministry of Latvia, please let us know. Thank you to all of you. And just to those who are more interested in the Arctic, what we are doing, as Andreas already referred to that, they did a paper together with Andreas Osthagen, and we have got colleagues in Stockholm who are covering the Arctic topic much more than I'm doing, because I'm doing it in connection to the Baltic countries. So if you've got any interest in the Arctic, please go to either to the Facebook site or to the webpage of the Stockholm office of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. the Nordic countries project, you will find it under that. And thank you for being with us today, and hope to see you somewhere, somehow, sometime. Thank you.